Sverdlovsk, June 12, 1938. A cozy courtyard of wooden houses on Pervomaiskaya Street. 4-year-old Gerda Gribanova played alone. The trusting residents calmly let their children play outside all day long and had no idea that a murderer with twisted and dark thoughts could be hiding nearby. The girl's parents went to the theater as her grandfather watched her through the window. But as soon as he looked away for a minute, Gerda disappeared without a trace. At first, the police didn't pay much attention to it, but where could such a little girl have gone? She'll play and come back. Maybe she went to visit some friends or relatives. The parents, together with the neighbors, searched the area. It was all in vain. Only on the 4th day was the child's body found near the place where she disappeared, under a bird cherry bush in one of the gardens. The criminal cut off the girl's access to oxygen and then chaotically stabbed her entire body with a knife. The arms and one leg were separated from the body, but there were no traces of blood on the ground. That means the perpetrator committed the crime somewhere else and then brought the body to the overgrown garden and hid it under an old coat and a pile of leaves. Unfortunately, due to YouTube's censorship, I can't show some documentary materials, so I'll leave them in the Telegram channel /Noti. Go ahead, subscribe and check it out. The link is below the video. The examination showed that Gerda died quickly from heart paralysis, which occurred as a result of brain damage caused by a blow to the head. Most of the injuries and wounds were inflicted post-mortem. The perpetrator did not leave any biological traces. But at that time, rubber contraceptives were already being sold quite freely in Sverdlovsk. Therefore, the investigators did not rule out the theory that the girl could have been abducted for lewd purposes, especially since some of the injuries indicated that after death, a perverse act could have been committed with the body. 2 local troublemakers fell under suspicion. They had a feud with the girl's father, Pyotr Gribanov. Neighbors said that the suspects had threatened to rob his house. A knife was confiscated from one of the detainees, and the other testified that his friend killed the girl as an unnecessary witness. But this version was not confirmed. Experts found a fragment of a blade in the girl's skull, but the confiscated knife was sharpened. The detainee admitted that he falsely accused his friend out of fear of being blamed for the gruesome murder of the child. The investigation has reached a dead end. While the investigators were interrogating the suspects, Dushegub went hunting again. 3-year-old Nina Pleshchayeva disappeared on Henry Marty Street. Her worried mother rushed to look for the child and soon heard moans coming from a box of hay for horses. The girl had bruises on her neck as if someone had been squeezing her throat. Nina said that a young stranger approached her, asked her to show him where the restroom was, and then attacked her and squeezed her neck. After a while, the girl woke up under a pile of hay and started crying. The doctor who examined the girl did not pay attention to the signs of strangulation and the bruises on her neck and told the parents that the child had simply been bitten by a cow. Nina didn't report it to the police because they were afraid that the authorities would treat them as negligently as the doctors did. Nina's story would only become known to investigators after the criminal was apprehended. In February 1939 on Lunacharsky Street, 5-year-old Natan Titov got carried away playing in the snow and left his sled unattended with his 2-year-old little brother Borya on it. A moment later, the little boy disappeared. When their mother returned, she rushed to search the area and called out for her child loudly. About 30 meters away, she saw a young man pulling a child's sled through the snow. The woman ran after him, but the perpetrator picked up the boy in his arms and ran away. Eyewitnesses had already called the police, and one of the officers searching the area noticed tracks as if something had been buried in the snow. After digging through the snowdrifts, he found the child whom the criminal had buried, hoping that the little witness would die. Borya Titov got away with just a scare and a few bruises, but he couldn't tell anything important about the kidnapper. The little boy was playing in the yard, came up to a young man and offered to go sledding. He quickly took him to a vacant lot and there he started to hurt him. The boy lost consciousness and came to in the snow. At that time, no one in the Soviet Union had ever heard of the existence of serial criminals. That's why the police officers didn't pay attention to the fact that it was only 200 meters from the place where Gerda Gribanova was abducted. The unpunished villain continued his crimes. On May 1, 1939, a young man approached 4-year-old Raya Rakhmatulina, who was waiting for her mother at home on Shevchenko Street. The young man gave the girl a coin and asked her to show him where the restroom was. Locking himself in the restroom with the victim, he pulled out a knife and began stabbing the girl chaotically, mostly in the face and head. Then he left her bleeding in the cesspit of the outhouse and fled. But Raya survived and managed to crawl outside, where a neighbor noticed her and immediately called the doctors. The girl lost her right eye. Her face looked as if it had been erased, but the little one's testimony only confused the investigation. Raya's native language was Bashkir, and she spoke Russian poorly and couldn't clearly explain whether it was an uncle or an aunt who attacked her. The investigators only noted that judging by the location of the injuries, the attacker was left-handed. 2 suspects were detained in this case, but their guilt could not be proven, and the perpetrator returned to crime just a month and a half later. On June 12, in the village of Pionersky on Flotskaya Street, Alia Gubina went missing. Her father and stepmother were having a party with friends and didn't notice how the 2-year-old girl was lured away by a piece of candy and a stranger. He took Alia to the deserted Osnovensky Park and, looking guilty, attacked the girl with a knife. An hour later, some passers-by noticed a child under a tree. The girl had a cut on her stomach, but she was still alive. The doctors did not expect to save the little girl, but the young and talented Zinaida Niganova managed to perform a flawless operation, saving the girl's life and preventing sepsis from developing. However, when Alia woke up after the anesthesia, she didn't remember anything about how she ended up under the tree in the park or who had inflicted those terrible wounds on her. The next crime was committed in the village of Krasnaya Zvezda. 3-year-old Rita Konjina slipped away from her strict mother to play outside and disappeared without a trace. 2 days later, the girl's body was found in the woods by neighbors who were herding a flock of goats nearby. The villain cut off Rita's air supply, stabbed her with a knife, abused her body, and then covered the crime scene with grass and placed a large stone over the victim's head. On the girl's body, they found a shoe print that was surprisingly small, only size 36. Meanwhile, Sverdlovsk was buzzing with terrible rumors. Frightened parents tried not to let their children out of their sight, but not everyone could watch their kids around the clock because of strict work schedules. The investigators had already realized that one person might be behind the crimes, and they were looking for the perpetrator among hardened criminals. They didn't have any distinguishing features of the suspect, so they had to question everyone in a row. Most of those detained were released after their alibis were confirmed. Several dozen of the most suspicious ones were kept behind bars, but the crimes continued, which meant that Dushagub had not been caught. Then the head of the city police department got an order from the regional authorities to increase patrols on the streets of Sverdlovsk. For the suspects, additional groups of police officers from other cities were sent to patrol, and cadets from the police academy were also mobilized. To blend in, the patrols went out on the streets in regular clothes, but they were all armed. They were instructed to pay attention to any suspicious people with children, especially if a young man was leading a child somewhere. On October 24, 1939, Slava Volkov's mother got her 3-year-old son ready for a walk on Kulturi Street. She forgot something in the apartment, so she left the boy for a minute under the supervision of his older sister Rita and went back home. But then her daughter came into the apartment after her and said that a young man had approached her and Slava on the street and told her that their mother had asked her to go back home while he watched the little boy. It was immediately clear that something terrible had happened, but little Slava was nowhere to be found. The child was saved by chance. 3 patrol officers were on duty near the tram line on the outskirts of the city, in an area considered troubled and therefore placed under special control. At the Medny Rudnik stop, a young man got off the next tram with a little boy. No one would have paid attention to him, but Ivan Popov, a cadet at the police academy, sensed something was wrong and followed him. The suspicious young man led the child not toward the houses but toward the forest, where the body of Rita Kanjina had recently been found. The cadet signaled to his classmates who were on duty nearby, and the 3 of them began to follow the young man, spreading out and keeping their distance. In the forest, the young man picked up the child, carried him deep into the thicket, took off his coat, and suddenly pushed the little one to the ground. To squeeze the neck, patrolmen with Nagant revolvers rushed at the maniac and subdued him. According to rumors, the detainee cried even louder than the injured boy. The next day, the newspaper Ural workers published a note. Sverdlovsk police officers arrested the bandit sadist G. Vinnichevsky. Recently, in the area of the Uralmash Zavod settlement, he kidnapped a 3-year-old boy, Slavik Volkov, took him deep into the forest and tried to kill him. The police rescued the boy and apprehended the bandit at the scene of the crime. Similar crimes in Sverdlovsk were committed by V. Vinnichevsky. He fully admitted his guilt. The outcome of the case shocked the investigators. They were looking for a ruthless criminal, but the perpetrator turned out to be a 16-year-old boy. Nowadays, teenage cruelty is often blamed on the influence of movies and computer games, but back then, there was nothing like that. Even books about crimes were rare, and no one gave such literature to school children. V. Vinnichevsky developed his sophisticated criminal signature entirely on his own, driven only by his pathological craving for cruelty, which he skillfully hid from those around him until the very moment of his arrest. Vladimir Georgievich Vinnichevsky was born in Sverdlovsk on June 8, 1923. His family was fairly well off. His mother worked as a bookkeeper. There are different accounts about his father's job. Most often it is written that he worked as a foreman in the city utilities in Sverdlovsk. Rumor has it the maniac's father was a former Chekist. The boy started stuttering after he fell into a deep pit as a child and was badly injured. Volodya grew up weak, had pneumonia several times, underwent throat surgery, had whooping cough, measles, and had his appendix removed. He didn't get along with his peers. The boys laughed at his stutter. Besides, Vinnichevsky was constantly in and out of hospitals. The boy was secretive, quiet, obedient. Until 5th grade, he did well in school and was considered a smart child. Then he got involved with a bad crowd and decided to run away to the Caucasus. Volodya always dreamed of traveling, preferably alone, far away from his parents. Together with his friends, he stole money and a revolver from his father and was planning to rob a military warehouse before the trip. But his parents noticed the missing money and weapon in time, scolded Volodya, and decided to transfer him to another school. Away from the bad influence of his friends, there the boy quickly started falling behind. He was held back twice. He explained this by constant headaches and memory problems. The boy was always biting his nails. He drooled a lot and he often laughed for no reason, explaining it by saying he remembered a funny incident from school. The parents took the child to a neurologist, but at the children's clinic they said there was nothing unusual about these symptoms, and that everything would pass once puberty was over. The doctors prescribed electrotherapy, but the teenager didn't want to go through with the procedures. Volodya completely lost interest in studying and wanted to start working as soon as possible, but his parents insisted on the importance of education. Then Vinnichevsky ran away to Nizhny Tagil, where he was soon detained and handed over to his mother, who had come for him. The boy had to return to his studies, and soon he managed to make a friend among his classmates, the future famous sculptor Ernst Neizvestny. The boys interacted at school and occasionally visited each other's homes. When Vinnichevsky's acquaintances were questioned as possible witnesses, Ernst couldn't recall anything special about his classmate. The quiet and shy boy liked to be alone and never showed any aggression or strange behavior. Volodya didn't like to read, but he watched movies in the theater with interest, especially patriotic ones. He also took piano lessons. At the age of 15, Vinnichevsky began to show signs of puberty. One day, his mother found love letters to girls and scolded her son strictly, believing that such feelings were premature for a schoolboy. His father frightened Volodya with stories about venereal diseases and strictly forbade him from having any relationships with the opposite sex. After that, Vinnichevsky never showed any interest in girls again. Perhaps the fact that he slept in the same room with his parents influenced the teenager's development, although they claim that they never had any intimacy in the child's presence. On the other hand, during the early Soviet era, communal apartments and living in the same room with one's parents was more than common. During interrogations, Vinnichevsky recalled that his mother would send him to the pharmacy to get medication for his father's erectile dysfunction. She didn't say what the medicine was for, but he figured it out himself. The boy had a complicated relationship with his father. The parent often took out his anger on his son and threatened to send him to a boarding school. Volodya also witnessed his father's manipulative behavior and aggression towards his mother. The boy himself never behaved aggressively. He did not show the common tendency among maniacs to torture animals. Only once was Volodya caught in the company of children who were trying to bury a dog alive. At that time, his parents thought that the quiet boy had simply been dragged along by a group of troublemakers. After that, the child treated animals kindly, nursed sick rabbits and asked to get a piglet. The boy loved children, especially little ones. His mother recalled that he enjoyed sometimes sitting with toddlers in the sandbox and helping them make sandcastles. Later, the children told their parents that the boy was choking them, but the parents assumed he was just playing rough and the kids were confused. A family with 2 children, ages 3 and 5, lived in the next room of the barrack on Pervomaiskaya Street. But Vinnichevsky never behaved suspiciously around them. The boy was afraid that he would be suspected of strange tendencies, but still he committed his first crime not far from home. On that ill-fated day, Gerda was playing alone. Her parents had gone to the theater and her grandfather was taking care of her older sister, who had developed a fever after having a tooth removed. When 15-year-old Volodya Vinnichevsky approached Gerda, she wasn't afraid. The children lived on the same street and knew each other. The boy suggested they go to the garden, and Gerda obediently followed him. In case they were caught by adults, Vinnichevsky came up with an excuse that he was going around the yards as an activist, collecting scrap metal and looking for old iron, which he could later come back for with his sponsored pistols. But that day, no one called out to the children. In the bushes, the teenager undressed the girl and started to tickle her. Gerda laughed, thinking his actions were just a strange game. The agitated psychopath grabbed the girl by the neck and squeezed tightly. During the interrogations, he recalled in detail how his victim lost consciousness and blood started coming from her nose. Vinnichevsky liked this. Then he took out a knife and began to strike blow after blow with fury. He struck so hard that he broke off the tip of the blade. Then he desecrated the body and cut off several parts from it. He wrapped the remains in an old coat and hid them in a pile of leaves under the bird cherry bushes. 4 days later, 12-year-old Vasya Molchanov climbed into that garden hoping to steal something to eat and discovered the mutilated body among the bushes. Adults and police rushed to the boy's screams. Some in the crowd yawned. Volodya Vinnichevsky stood nearby. Now all investigators know that criminals are drawn to return to the scene of their crimes, and they try to record the details of everyone who likes to gawk at the blood and lifeless bodies. But back then, forensics was not so well developed, and no one suspected that the dushegub had come one last time to look at the result of his crime together with the frightened neighbors. At the place where little Gerda died, there is now a park next to the monument to the Afghan soldiers. After his arrest, Vinnichevsky openly told investigators that he killed children for sexual pleasure. He started being interested in girls at the age of 12, but his parents refused to discuss the topic and told him that he would understand everything himself when he got older. The boy sensed some insincerity in their words, which only fueled his curiosity even more. At the end of 1937, the teenager's parents made a new friend, Nikolai Karpushin, who liked to have frank conversations with the boy after drinking. He told Volodya where children come from in every detail. This awakened new feelings in the boy, and he began to seek more interaction with his female classmates. But the shy Zaika was not popular with the opposite sex. At the same time, he came across a book called Onanism: Its Consequences, which completely discouraged the teenager from satisfying his needs on his own. Then Vinnichevsky began to have thoughts about taking someone by force. He discussed this idea with his older friend, and Karpushin tried to talk the teenager out of it. After all, the girl would definitely remember her attacker, tell the police, and he would be arrested. And in general, having relations with a woman is not safe because a child could result from it. The talkative drunkard had no idea what kind of thoughts this would provoke in the boy. On November 23, 1939, Nikolai Karpushin was interrogated by the police, but he couldn't provide the investigation with anything important. In the spring of 1938, Vinnichevsky decided that he wanted at any cost to force himself on some girl. He knew if the victim raised an alarm, he'd be caught. Therefore, he decided that he needed to choose a weak child who would not be able to resist, and first take her life, then violate the body. In early May 1938, he took a heavy pestle from a mortar, hid at the corner of Shartashskaya and Mamino-Sibiryaka streets, a block and a half from his house, and began waiting for a suitable victim. Around 7 p.m., a girl about 7 years old in a black coat walked by. The villain sneaked up behind her and struck her on the head with the pestle. The girl started crying but did not fall. Then Vinnichevsky struck her again and hit her on the shoulder. His victim fell to her knees and began to scream loudly. The criminal had to flee with the weapon he used in the attack. The violence against the girl gave him unprecedented pleasure, and now Vinnichevsky became completely obsessed with plans to commit a crime. From his first failure, he concluded that he needed to choose younger children, since he couldn't handle a 7-year-old. He also needed a way to keep the victims from raising an alarm. On May 21, 1938, in the Park of Culture, Vinnichevsky noticed a 3-year-old girl who had gotten lost and was wandering alone. The criminal took her by the hand, led her into the bushes, and began to squeeze her neck. Teenagers passing by scared off the maniac. But it was after this that Vinnichevsky concluded that blocking a victim's access to oxygen with his hands was the best way to immobilize a child with pleasure and without unnecessary noise. By the time he attacked Gerda Gribanova, the novice maniac was already prepared. He really enjoyed touching the victim's naked body and making cuts. It was then that his criminal signature finally took shape: to squeeze the throat, abuse the body, and inflict wounds. But the criminal was too afraid of being caught to always act the same way. He tried to confuse the investigation, attacking both girls and boys. He tried to choose victims in different areas, took some of their belongings to throw them away in random places and throw the investigators off the trail. Vinnichevsky couldn't stand screaming, so he always tried to cut off the child's access to oxygen, but he didn't inflict wounds on everyone. He tried to make the results of his crimes look different each time. The criminal made sure to carefully hide the body in grass, dry leaves, and snow. He considered cesspools of outdoor wooden toilets, which were very common at that time, to be the best place. The smell of the latrine effectively concealed the traces of the crime. Sometimes Vinnichevsky committed lewd acts but did not take the child's life. Sometimes random passers-by prevented him from finishing the act, and the maniac fled the crime scene, leaving the wounded victim behind. After Slavik Volkov was abducted, the villain decided to attack. It was a great idea to take the kidnapped child away by tram to a less crowded area, far from the place where people would be looking for him. But it was exactly this plan that ended with his arrest. After his arrest, Vinnichevsky spoke easily and openly to the investigator about everything he had done. He gave testimony about 12 attacks and killings, including the one during which he was caught. On the day of his arrest, Vinnichevsky claimed that he was not involved in any other crimes, but 9 days later he decided to add a few more confessions to his testimony. It turned out that during a trip to Nizhny Tagil, the teenager killed Rita Fomina. The girl was 2.5 years old. Vinnichevsky committed another attack in the city of Kushva, 190 kilometers from Sverdlovsk. His parents brought him there for treatment. Because of his stutter, the boy seized the moment and attacked 3-year-old Vanya. He took the girl's life, assaulted her, and threw her remains into a cesspit. In total, the teenager is responsible for 18 attacks. 8 victims died. 2 more girls were mutilated with a knife but managed to survive. With the others present, the criminal couldn't finish because he was scared off. The criminal case files amounted to several volumes. Vinnichevsky's parents knew nothing about their son's actions. On the day of his arrest, his father went to the police to report his child missing. Volodya was sent to get some sugar and he didn't come back. His mother said that the boy often went to the store or ran errands and would only come back several hours later. One day she tried to follow her son, but he kept looking back and noticed her. One time he came back with a torn shirt and a scratch on his neck and said that he had fallen off his bicycle. It was his mother who took care of the household and did the laundry, and only once did she find a bloodstain on his handkerchief. Her son said that he had gotten into a fight with some boys and they believed his excuse. The father said even less. He knew nothing about the crimes, had noticed no tendencies in his son. He was a cold and distant parent, so he didn't really know his child. After the interrogations, Vinnichevsky's parents brought a letter to the Ural Worker newspaper in which they stated that they knew nothing about his tendencies. We are the parents of this scoundrel mentioned in the crime section on November 1, 1939. Having become completely convinced of his utterly horrific crimes, we, as his parents, disown such a son and demand that the highest measure of punishment be applied to him, execution by shooting. There can be no place for such degenerates in a Soviet family. In truth, the mother later admitted that she wrote the letter under pressure from her husband. She never believed that her son was guilty of all those atrocities. Until the very end, the grieving mother went from one official to another and wrote letters to every possible authority, begging them to pardon her child. One day, the woman found a code written by Volodya with notes about when and where he attacked children. This led her to think that the boy might have had an adult accomplice. Vinnichevskaya spent many years searching for the person who involved her child in these terrible crimes, but she never found any trace of an accomplice or any evidence of Volodya's innocence. Vinnichevsky himself was calm about his arrest. He was sure that at his age he could not be sentenced to the highest penalty. The boy actively cooperated with the investigation and was preparing for a long imprisonment. In prison, he was cheerful and lively, walking around the cell, singing songs and reciting obscene poems of his own composition. But he didn't know that in 1935 an order was issued allowing children to be sentenced to execution for especially serious crimes. Professor Malkin's conclusion was discouraging for the teenager. Vladimir Georgievich belongs to the category of deep psychopaths with a pathological tendency, a sadist who destroys children, a strangler. He does not suffer from chronic or mental illness. He has never been in a state where he could not fully understand his actions and their possible consequences. I come to the conclusion that Vladimir Georgievich Vinnichevsky is sane. Initially, Vinnichevsky's crimes were classified under Section E of the article. 136 Intentional deprivation of life using the helpless state of the victim, Criminal Code of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. However, later this article in the criminal case was carefully replaced with Article 59/3 banditry. This was necessary so that the government decree on measures to combat crime would apply to the criminal among others, according to which the little murderer could be sentenced to the highest penalty. On January 16, 1940, Vinnichevsky was sentenced to death, but the lawyer tried to appeal the decision, insisting on the defendant's mental illness. The criminal's mother wrote a letter to Stalin asking for the case to be reconsidered. She couldn't see any pleasure in taking children's lives. Only a madman or someone under someone else's influence could do that. She also insisted that her boy was driven to suicide. He was deliberately tried under the wrong article so they could sentence him to execution. The sentence was overturned and the teenager was sent for a second evaluation in Moscow to the Serbsky Institute. The Moscow psychiatrist's examination produced the same result. He is wary, insincere, tries to give the impression of being mentally deficient, complains about lack of understanding, and deliberately gives wrong answers when his school knowledge is tested. He does not suffer from a mental illness, but shows residual effects from a brain disease he had in childhood, which was accompanied by a change in character and a tendency towards sexual perversions. Saying, on August 5, 1940, the court upheld the death sentence, but Rostock tried once again to seek a pardon. His letter, written in a childish handwriting with typical schoolboy mistakes, has been preserved in the archives. To the Presidium of the Supreme Court of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic from Vladimir Georgievich Vinnichevsky, who was sentenced to be shot. Appeal. I was sentenced to the highest measure of punishment. For a year and a half, I committed brutal crimes for sexual gratification. I fully admit my guilt. I started my crimes at the age of 14 and then it was hard for me to stop them. There was no one to stop me since no one knew about my crimes. I'm still young. If I am not given the highest punishment, I will be able to atone for my guilt. I ask you to spare my life. August 28 Vinnichevsky. The petition for pardon was sent to Moscow. It was considered for a long time, but was ultimately rejected. On November 11, 1940, the sentence was carried out. Vladimir Vinnichevsky was 17 years and 5 months old. Ironically, one of the sculptures by his famous classmate Ernst Neizvestny was installed over the Maniac's burial site. The artist wanted to immortalize the memory of political prisoners repressed in the 1930s and created the monument Masks of Sorrow. He tried to have the monument installed in the center of Yekaterinburg, but the authorities refused to approve the location. Several times the location of the sculpture was changed and there was even talk of moving it to Chelyabinsk, but in the end, after the death of Ernst Neizvestny, the city authorities reached a compromise. It was decided to place the monument at the 12th kilometer of the Moscow highway, above the site of a mass grave of those executed in the Sverdlovsk region. However, besides repressed political prisoners, ordinary criminals are also buried in the mass grave. Under the same mournful monument is also buried the maniac who committed 18 attacks on children, 7th grader Vladimir Vinnichevsky. And what do you think about this story? Like, dislike, hit the bell, be sure to leave comments and subscribe to the Strashnody Telegram channel. I post additional materials and sources there. And check out other videos on the channel. They come out even though YouTube doesn't always send you notifications.